The camera lights were hot, almost blinding. A live studio audience buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just another televised debate, it was a showdown. Ibrahim Traoré had never stepped into an American network studio like this, and certainly not across from someone like Kash Patel. Minutes before going live, a producer whispered nervously into her headset, "We're rolling in 30, and they haven't even said a word to each other." That was by design. Traoré sat calmly, hands folded on the table. Dressed in a tailored dark green suit, his posture radiated control. Kash, on the other hand, leaned back with a smug grin, tapping his pen on the armrest, eyes fixed on his opponent like a lion sizing up prey. The moderator barely got through the welcome. Tonight, we're joined by two radically different worldviews. Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, and Kash Patel, former national security official and conservative analyst. The first question was about African sovereignty. Before Traoré could respond, Kash cut in with a chuckle. "You can talk about sovereignty all you want, but let's be real, history won't remember this moment. Or you." Gasps rippled through the audience. The tension clicked from uncomfortable to electric. Traoré turned toward him slowly. "You think history won't remember me?" he said quietly, with a slight smile. "You underestimate history. It remembers those who build, not those who belittle." Kash shrugged. "You're posturing, not building. You're on this stage because it makes for good television, not because your ideas matter." Traoré leaned forward just an inch, his voice steady. "I'm not here for your approval. I'm here because my people no longer ask permission to be free." That was the moment the audience shifted in their seats. Some leaned in. Others stared. Kash tapped his pen again, but now it sounded nervous, not cocky. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be a normal debate. This was personal. And both men knew it. The moderator, clearly caught off guard by the escalating tension, cleared his throat. "Let's stay on topic, Mr. Traoré. You were about to respond regarding economic independence in West Africa." But Traoré didn't look at the moderator. He kept his gaze fixed on Kash. "You want to talk about economics?" he asked calmly. "Let's talk about the system that hands us crumbs and calls it assistance. Let's talk about the corporations that strip our land and lecture us on governance. Let's talk about who really writes history, and who it silences." Kash chuckled, this time more defensively. "Oh please. You're blaming the West for your own failed institutions. That's the easy way out. You want to act like some revolutionary, when really, you're just playing dress-up with slogans." The crowd murmured. One woman in the front row whispered, "He went too far." Traoré sat back, measured. "You confuse dignity with costume, Mr. Patel. But that's expected from someone who's never had to reclaim anything. You inherited power. I had to rip it from the ground, with blood and patience." Kash scoffed. "You glorify struggle because it distracts from your results, or lack thereof." A subtle change came over Traoré's face. Not anger. Not offense. Something deeper, disappointment. "My people grow their own food now. Our children learn in their own language. We export rice to our neighbors instead of waiting for bags stamped with foreign flags. If that's not results, then your definition of success must be very small." The moderator leaned forward. "Mr. Patel, how do you respond to that kind of transformation?" Kash folded his arms. "I respond by asking who paid for your microphone tonight. You want to critique the West while sitting in our studios, using our platforms, enjoying the reach our systems provide. That's rich." Traoré didn't flinch. He simply turned to the camera. "Let the world hear this, we came not to beg, not to borrow, but to build. And yes, we'll use every tool we must. Even this one." The camera zoomed in. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words made the room feel smaller. Backstage, a technician whispered, "He's not playing defense. He's rewriting the rules." By the time the third question came, the debate had morphed into something else entirely. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was a philosophical duel, broadcast live across millions of screens. The moderator posed a question about security alliances in Africa, but it hung unanswered in the air. Kash leaned in, adjusting his lapel mic like a performer prepping for his big moment. "I'll tell you what this really is," he said. "This is what happens when you let someone with a chip on their shoulder dictate global narratives. You think just because you've walked through fire, you deserve to lecture the rest of us?" Traoré didn't blink. "No," he said. "I've walked through fire, and I've earned the right to speak for those who still burn." There was no applause. Just a weighted silence that demanded attention. Kash pressed on, feeling the momentum slip. "Your ideas are naive. Romantic, even. You act like building local farms and teaching kids in their dialects will challenge world powers." Traoré raised his hand slowly, stopping him mid-sentence. "You mistake clarity for naivety," he said. "When you've been fed lies for decades, truth sounds foolish. But that doesn't make it wrong." The audience murmured again, this time in agreement. People began pulling out their phones, recording, live tweeting, reframing the moment before the broadcast even ended. Behind the scenes, the network's analytics team reported a sudden spike in viewer engagement. Hashtags like #TraorLive and #TruthOnAir began trending. Sensing he was losing the narrative, Kash tried to shift tactics. "You think this performance of yours is a threat to real power? You're a moment. We're the system." Traoré smiled softly. "Then maybe," he said, "it's time the moment outlives the system." It wasn't anger. It wasn't attack. It was something more dangerous, calm certainty. The moderator stepped in, trying to steer things back. "Let's move forward to solutions." But it was too late. Traoré had already done something more powerful than winning the debate. He had changed the tone of it. The control room was chaos. Producers shouted over one another. Cut to a wide shot. "No, stay on Traoré." Zoom on Kash's reaction, "He's unraveling." But inside the studio, time felt suspended. Traoré's words hadn't just struck Kash. They had pierced the protective armor of Western certainty. And for the first time, Kash looked like he wasn't sure what to say. He reached for water, hands not quite steady. Traoré used the silence. Not to gloat, but to speak deeper. "You say I'm just a moment," he said, voice calm. "But moments are what history is made of. A man sitting at a lunch counter. A woman refusing to give up her seat. A farmer planting rice on scorched soil. We become memories when we move." Kash finally found his voice. "You're using poetic lines to hide hard facts. Your economy is fragile. Your defense is non-existent. Your currency depends on foreign reserves. You don't challenge us, you lean on us." "No," Traoré said, "we've leaned long enough. And now we're learning to stand." Kash pointed directly at him. "But your people suffer. You say you're breaking free, yet they still wait in line for food, for medicine, for hope." Traoré didn't deny it. "Yes, they suffer. But at least now they suffer while fighting. Not while begging." That landed harder than any accusation. In the front row, a young journalist whispered to her colleague, "He's not defending himself. He's defining himself." The moderator tried to reset. "Mr. Patel, would you like to offer your policy critique of Traoré's Rice for All initiative?" Kash exhaled, trying to regain footing. "Sure. It's a fantasy. You can't scale subsistence farming into geopolitical independence." Traoré looked directly into the camera. "Then come see it," he said. Bring your cameras. Walk our fields. Ask our people. We're not just feeding our land, we're feeding a new narrative. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. The silence spoke for them. And Kash Patel, once the loudest man in the room, now looked smaller, surrounded by truths he couldn't dismiss. Backstage, the mood was shifting. What had begun as a ratings ploy, pairing an idealistic African leader with a sharp-tongued conservative, was morphing into a global reckoning. The studio wasn't just a room anymore. It was a battleground of narratives. And the world was watching. In the green room, a network executive whispered into his phone, "This isn't a debate anymore. This is history being challenged on air." Back on stage, the moderator made a last-ditch effort to steer the conversation into safer waters. "Mr. Traoré, many critics argue that you've isolated Burkina Faso by rejecting aid and military partnerships. Do you fear becoming irrelevant on the world stage?" That word, irrelevant, hung in the air like a loaded accusation. But Traoré didn't flinch. "Irrelevant to whom?" he asked. "To donors who tie every dollar to silence? To partners who trade protection for obedience? If irrelevance means refusing to kneel, then we accept it proudly." Kash pounced. "So you admit it, you're isolating your country. That's dangerous. That's selfish." Traoré turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "You call it selfish. I call it sober. You see, the world doesn't fear a poor Africa. It fears a proud one." For the first time, a few audience members clapped, tentatively, but undeniably. Kash's jaw clenched. Pride won't buy antibiotics. It won't pave roads or keep extremists at bay. Neither did dependence, Traoré countered. We spent decades trading our dignity for security. We got neither. The moderator tried to interject, but Kash raised his voice. "You talk like a prophet, but you lead like a gambler. You're betting your people's future on ideals." Traoré's tone sharpened, but not his volume. "No, Mr. Patel. I'm betting it on belief. That my people, given the chance, can rise without your approval. Without your blueprint." That hit harder than any accusation could. It was more than ideology. It was identity. In that moment, Traoré didn't just sound like a leader. He sounded like a page turning. And Kash, despite his experience, his wit, his practiced jabs, seemed caught between two truths. One, that the system he represented was being questioned in real time. And two, that he didn't have an answer ready. The lights in the studio seemed brighter now, not because the technicians turned them up, but because the tension had peeled back every layer of civility. The room wasn't cold anymore. It pulsed with something raw. Even Kash felt it. He shifted in his seat, rolling his pen between his fingers, the grin long gone. This wasn't the performance he'd expected. He had prepared to debate a soundbite politician, not confront a man turning resistance into doctrine. But he couldn't back down. Not on live TV. "You talk about dignity like it's a strategy," Kash snapped. "But dignity doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't buy tanks. You say you're building something new? Without the West, you won't last 5 years." Traoré tilted his head, then smiled. "That's what they told my grandfather. When he refused to pick cotton for free." The crowd stirred. The moderator's mouth parted slightly, as if unsure whether to interrupt or just let history unfold. "You see," Traoré continued, "we were never supposed to last. Not without your maps. Not without your banks. Not without your language in our mouths. But we're still here." He pointed at the lens. "And that's why this bothers you. Because it means you don't own the narrative anymore." Kash stood. He hadn't planned to, but the words had gotten under his skin. "Own the narrative? You're using our airwaves, sitting in our studios, speaking to our voters. If we didn't build the stage, you wouldn't be heard at all. Traoré stood too. Not in retaliation. In declaration. And yet, he said, stepping forward slowly, here I am. And you're the one raising your voice. A hush dropped like a curtain. In that moment, the contrast was visceral. Kash, tight fists, flushed face, veins pulsing at his temples. Traoré, composed, upright, steady as stone. The image burned into the cameras. And across millions of screens, a quiet realization spread. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a transfer of control. The network cut to a commercial, brief, unplanned. They needed to breathe. So did the audience. So did Kash. But Traoré? He was just getting started. When the cameras returned, both men were seated again. But everything had changed. The energy. The focus. The hierarchy. Kash tried to reassert dominance, this time by taking the high road. Look, he said with a forced smile, I'm not here to disrespect your people. But the idea that you can reject alliances, reject economic support, and somehow thrive alone, it's reckless. You'll end up hurting the very people you claim to protect. Traoré leaned forward, voice low but unshakable. You think standing alone is isolation. But sometimes, standing alone is leadership. A pause. He let the words breathe. My people don't need pity. They need options. We've been told for generations that without you, we'd starve. That without your aid, your weapons, your validation, we'd disappear. He looked Kash dead in the eye. But we didn't disappear. We adapted. We fought. We farmed. We taught our children in the language their grandmothers dreamed in. Kash tried to interrupt. You're romanticizing. No, Traoré said sharply. I'm remembering. There's a difference. The moderator, unsure whether to interfere or protect ratings, simply let the scene unfold. Kash's frustration boiled over. You're rewriting history in real time, and people are buying it. Traoré raised an eyebrow. No. I'm correcting it. You wrote the first draft. We're writing the truth. That line echoed. Across studio walls. Across timelines and tweets. Across continents. A senior journalist watching from Washington tweeted. Traoré isn't defending his position. He's redefining what leadership looks like. By now, even viewers who had tuned in for drama were leaning in with quiet awe. This wasn't performance. This was revolution, on the airwaves. And the more Kash tried to play offense, the more he exposed that he wasn't ready for a conversation where he wasn't in control. The final segment was supposed to be about shared solutions. But at this point, the debate had shifted beyond policy. It had become a mirror. And for many watching, Kash Patel no longer looked like the reflection they wanted to see. Let's get practical, Kash said, forcing composure. Burkina Faso is landlocked, surrounded by fragile governments, under threat from terrorism. You think self-sufficiency is going to stop bullets? You think rice fields replace intelligence networks? Traoré didn't blink. Self-sufficiency doesn't stop bullets. But dependence loads the gun. That line was a hammer. Even the moderator froze. Someone in the audience gasped. Kash laughed nervously. You've got slogans. I've got facts. Traoré folded his hands calmly. Your facts built a world that still hasn't fed all its children. So maybe it's time for new ones. He leaned forward. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for distance. So we can build without being dismantled. The moderator jumped in. Mr. Traoré, are you saying the West should step back entirely from Africa? Traoré paused. No, he said slowly. I'm saying the West should stop believing Africa belongs to it. The audience erupted. Not in cheers, but in realization. That was the core. Not resentment. Not pride. Just the quiet demand to be left to build. Backstage, producers were panicking. Phones were lighting up. Headlines were already being written. Traoré redraws the map of power, live. The debate that recentered Africa. Kash Patel meets his match. Kash looked shaken. His smirk never returned. He was playing chess on a board Traoré had flipped without warning. He reached for one last punch. Let me tell you how this ends. Your people will suffer when the cameras stop rolling. They always do. What you're selling is hope. But hope can't feed a nation. Traoré stood again. This time, not to counter, but to close. You're right, he said softly. Hope alone doesn't feed a nation. But without it, no one plants the first seed. Silence hung in the studio like fog after a storm. There was no applause. No moderator intervention. No smug grin from Kash. Just the echo of Traoré's words settling into the bones of everyone watching. Hope doesn't feed a nation. But it plants the first seed. And for the millions watching across time zones, from students in Dakar to journalists in DC, that seed had just been planted. Backstage, a producer whispered into her headset, "We can't end it here. Not yet. The world's watching something bigger than a debate." Kash, visibly unsettled, glanced off camera as if waiting for someone to rescue him. But there would be no lifeline. No commercial break could undo the truth that had just been spoken. "I'll give you this," Kash muttered, standing up. "You know how to put on a show." Traoré didn't rise this time. He remained seated, grounded, like the soil he often spoke of. "This wasn't a show," he replied. "This was a reminder. That you don't own the stage anymore." Kash laughed dryly. "So now what? You declare moral victory while your country struggles for power, infrastructure, basic medicine?" Traoré leaned forward, calm but resolute. "We're struggling, yes. But we're struggling forward. You call it failure. I call it transformation. And we'll keep walking, even if you don't clap." That line sparked something unexpected. In the audience, a single person stood. Then another. Then 5. Then the room. A quiet standing ovation, not for charisma, not for defiance, but for something far more dangerous. Conviction. Kash looked around, the realization creeping in. He hadn't lost a debate. He'd witnessed a shift. One that couldn't be spun in headlines or buried in analysis. Something had happened here, live, unscripted, and no narrative control could undo it. As the show wrapped, the moderator stumbled to deliver a closing line, but no one heard her. All eyes were on Traoré. And as the cameras panned out, he didn't smile or wave. He simply sat there, still and steady. A leader who had just redrawn the edges of power, with nothing more than truth and presence. The show ended, but the conversation had only begun. Clips of the exchange flooded social media within minutes. Traoré dismantles Kash Patel on live TV. A new voice rises from Burkina Faso. This wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. But Traoré didn't linger in the studio. He slipped out quietly, flanked by just 2 aides and no entourage. No triumphant speeches. No interviews. Just a silent walk under the city's gray evening sky. Inside a quiet cafe near the East River, he finally sat down, not as a president or debater, but as a man who knew what had just shifted. His advisor asked gently, "Do you think it made a difference?" Traoré sipped his tea, eyes on the window. "We didn't win anything," he said softly. "But we were heard. Sometimes that's how change begins." Across the city, Kash sat in a private suite, eyes locked on a playback of the broadcast. No spin room. No applause. Just the weight of his own performance. And a single sentence echoing in his mind. "You don't own the stage anymore." It gnawed at him, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was true. The old script was breaking. In the days that followed, headlines continued to swirl. Commentators tried to frame the event as a symbolic clash. But people weren't talking about sound bites. They were talking about presence. About how a young African leader didn't shout or plead, but simply stood his ground and made the world listen. Weeks later, at a summit in Nairobi, leaders from across the continent referenced Traoré's appearance. One president said plainly, "He reminded us we don't need permission to lead." And in a symbolic move, a coalition of 5 African nations announced the formation of the Autonomy in Development Pact, a regional alliance focused on self-determined economic and agricultural cooperation, free from conditional foreign aid. The first signature was from Burkina Faso. Traoré didn't need to write a manifesto. His words had already done the work. In the end, Kash Patel was right about one thing. History would remember what happened that night. But not in the way he'd imagined. Because when he said, "History will forget you," Traoré didn't argue. He simply wrote a new page. And this time, the world didn't look away. In an age where power often speaks loudest, Ibrahim Traoré chose to speak clearly. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. What unfolded on live television wasn't just a debate, it was a moment. A moment where history paused, shifted, and made room for a voice the world was told to overlook. Kash Patel came with a warning: "History will forget you." But Traoré didn't fight the insult. He simply answered with action, presence, and truth, and in doing so, etched his reply into the pages of history itself. Because in the end, history doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest. It remembers those who stand when silence is easier. It remembers those who build when the world doubts them. And on that night, it remembered Ibrahim Traoré.